Welcome to my fifth video in my series, a Dispy primer on Christian nationalism. In the last few videos, I've been addressing what are some presuppositional issues, some areas of thinking that are presumed, that are brought into the Christian nationalist discussion by dispensationalists that I want to challenge us to go back and reconsider and think more deeply about, and maybe even abandon some of those positions. And in this fifth video, I want to consider both the origin and the destiny of civil government and nations. A lot of modern dispensationalists seem to have the idea that um, civil government and nations are merely a product of the fall, and that they are going to cease to be in the eternal state, kind of just a temporary stopgap in this fallen world. And therefore, they're not something to wrangle about, to really get too involved in. And I think that's actually the opposite of the truth. So I'm going to actually argue from the end back to the beginning. If we were to go to the book of Revelation in chapter 21, Revelation 21, really, really important section of scripture that I don't know we've spent enough time thinking about, but in Revelation chapter 21, we're reminded that this is the eternal state. There's no sin. Um, no sin, eternal state. This is how things are going to be forever and forever. There's a sense in which we can say this is what God originally intended. Maybe we might say this is even better than God originally intended in terms of the first creation. And what we see in Revelation 21, verses 24 through 26, really, we could begin in verse 23. And the city has no need of the sun or of the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God has illumined it, and its lamp is the Lamb. And then listen to this. And the nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. And its gates will never be closed by day, for there will be no night. And they will bring the glory and honor of the nations into it. That's the new Jerusalem, obviously, there, the referent. So, what we know about the eternal state is that there is, in the eternal state where there's no sin, we still have civil government. We have the exercise of divinely delegated authority within a particular sphere. Not only do we have civil government, we also have nations. So, in the eternal state, when there's no longer any sin, there will still be distinctive nations, there will still be kings, there will still be civil government, there will be the exercise of divinely delegated authority. So when we go back then to the garden, we go back to what did God intend originally? Can we say that God intended that there would be nations? I don't know that we can make that argument, but we also can't argue that they are merely the product of the fall. At the end of the day, the civil government began in the garden pre-fall. Adam was delegated authority over his wife and over his children and over the whole earth. And as mankind would have spread across the face of the earth, there would be management required. There would be civil authority required. And naturally, what would happen, we're speculating here, naturally, what would happen is that rulers, leaders in a patriarchal system would develop, whether they be selected, whether it just comes from being the oldest. We don't exactly know, but it's just a function of how we were created that there's going to be a requirement for civil government, that there's going to be a requirement for leadership. And how do I know that? Well, because we need it even in the eternal state. And so it's not that civil government began with Noah, with the flood. No. Civil government existed pre-fall. The only thing that happened with Noah and the flood and the Noahic covenant was that now civil government has the legitimate use of the sword. Now, not only the legitimate use, but the obligation of using the sword to punish murderers. And there's probably a lex talionis type of thing going on there as well. We're limiting an eye for an eye. That's probably in play as well there, but primarily it's that the civil government, or really at that point when we think about it, and this is, you can even see how my thinking has been informed and is developing. Civil government didn't exist in one sense as we think about it now in Noah's day. When Noah was given the commandment for the death penalty, um, we're reminded of who committed the first murder. It was this within a familial unit, and so had it happened again in Noah's day, like it happened in Adam's day, it wouldn't have been a civil magistrate, somebody unrelated to the family, that would have carried out that capital punishment. And so, really, to say that civil government began with Noah really just isn't historically accurate, because when you think about it, it would have taken quite a few generations before we have civil government as we think about it now. So, really, what you have then in Genesis 9 is just the origin of the sword. Now, not everybody would agree with that. As I've said in other places, Luther would be one example of somebody that thought the use of the sword goes all the way back to Genesis 3. Whether or not he's right, I guess that's ultimately not relevant. But what we want to be clear on is that if we're going to think about the role of nations and the role of civil government, we need to look at the future. We need to look at the eternal state. What is it going to be like when there's no sin? There's going to be civil government and there's going to be nations. So they can't merely be a product of the fall and a necessary evil that we just kind of have to deal with in this age. They're not a bad thing. Civil government isn't a bad thing, and nations aren't a bad thing. So, how should that then inform how we think about civil government and nations in this era? And I would argue that there should be great continuity between pre fall and now, and then in glory. That all exercises of authority ought to be done in a godly way, and that's God's revealed will, and that all people in all nations would acknowledge him and worship him both publicly and privately. And I think the data, when we consider the Bible from front to back, really goes that direction. I hope that's helpful.